6 men, all doctors, all killers. This iceberg moves through the most disturbing crimes ever committed by physicians, organized from the cases that shocked a city to the ones that shook entire country. The higher levels are hard to believe. The lower ones are harder to forget. If you thought the most dangerous place to be was alone in a dark alley, these stories will make you reconsider a doctor's office. Let's begin. Kermit Baron Gosnell. Kermit Baron Gosnell did not look like the kind of man who would one day become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Born in Philadelphia in 1941, he was intelligent, educated, and respected. He excelled in school, earned degrees from prestigious institutions, and spent the early years of his medical career working with immigrants, refugees, and struggling families. To many people, he appeared compassionate, a doctor committed to helping those society often overlooked. But even in those early years, there were signs that something wasn't quite right. Controversy followed him almost from the beginning. In the early 1970s, he became involved in highly publicized abortion procedures that left several women seriously injured. While critics sounded alarms, he continued moving forward. In 1972, he opened the Women's Medical Society in West Philadelphia. From the outside, it seemed like a legitimate medical practice. Newspapers praised him. Community leaders respected him. Patients kept coming through the doors. Yet behind those doors, a different reality was slowly taking shape. As the years passed, financial troubles began piling up. By the late 1980s, debt and legal problems were closing in. Around that same time, rumors started spreading throughout Philadelphia. People whispered that if a woman was too far along in her pregnancy and couldn't find help anywhere else, there was one place that would take her. Gosnell's clinic became the destination of last resort. Women traveled from all over, desperate and often frightened. Many had nowhere else to turn. Gosnell charged thousands of dollars for late-term procedures, pulling in enormous sums. But despite the profits, the clinic itself was descending into something nightmarish. The building was filthy. Medical equipment sat stained and unsterilized. Hallways were cluttered with junk, blood-covered furniture. The smell of urine and decay lingered in the air. Trained employees performed duties that should have been handled by licensed professionals. Powerful drugs were handed out casually. Patients were heavily sedated and left unattended. The deeper investigators would later look, the darker the picture became. Women were given medications to induce labor and then left alone in cramped rooms. Some delivered babies into toilets. Others delivered on filthy furniture. What happened afterward would become the focus of one of the most horrifying criminal investigations Pennsylvania had ever seen. According to testimony presented in court, babies who showed signs of life after delivery were killed by severing their spinal cords with scissors. Former employees described it as routine. What should have shocked everyone had become normal inside those walls, and somehow year after year nobody stopped it. Complaints were filed, concerns were raised, yet government inspectors largely stayed away. For 16 years, the clinic avoided meaningful inspection. The operation continued unchecked, while conditions grew worse and worse. Then, in 2008, Gosnell added another illegal business to his operation. He began operating what authorities described as a pill mill, prescribing addictive narcotics, such as oxycodone and Xanax, to people who often had little or no medical need for them. Prescriptions were handed out in massive numbers, bringing in even more money. That decision would ultimately bring everything crashing down. On February 18, 2010, federal agents and local investigators raided the clinic while investigating illegal prescription drug activity. What they found inside stunned even experienced law enforcement officers. Rooms were packed with medical waste, Instruments were reused without proper sterilization. Cat feces littered parts of the building. Blood stained floors and furniture. Patients recovered under dirty blankets in unsanitary conditions. Then investigators made an even more horrifying discovery. Inside refrigerators, freezers, and storage containers, they found the remains of dozens of fetuses. Some were preserved in jars. Others were stored in bags and boxes scattered throughout the clinic. In total, authorities recovered the remains of 45 fetuses. Veteran investigators later described the scene as something they would never forget. As officials dug deeper, they uncovered another tragedy. A 41-year-old refugee named Karnamaya Mongar had died after receiving a fatal overdose of medication administered by unlicensed staff members. It wasn't just dangerous. It had already become deadly. In 2011, prosecutors charged Gosnell with multiple counts of murder, along with numerous other crimes. When the case finally reached trial in 2013, jurors were confronted with graphic photographs, physical evidence, and chilling testimony from former workers who described years of horrors hidden behind the clinic's walls. The image of a respected doctor completely collapsed. What emerged instead was a portrait of a man who, according to prosecutors, had spent years operating outside the law while vulnerable patients suffered around him. The jury ultimately found Gosnell guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder involving infants and 1 count of involuntary manslaughter for the death of Karnamaya Mongar. Facing the possibility of execution, he accepted a sentence of life in prison without parole. Today, Gosnell remains behind bars. The clinic is gone, the doors are closed. The rooms have long since been emptied. Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey's story began in the quiet hills of Kentucky. Raised in deep poverty in a small Appalachian town, his childhood was marked by isolation, trauma, and abuse. While other children spent their days playing and making friends, Harvey kept to himself, more comfortable around adults than kids his own age. There was always something unsettling about the way he seemed disconnected from the world around him. After dropping out of school, Harvey found himself drifting through life without direction. Then a family tragedy changed everything. While caring for his dying grandfather in a Kentucky hospital, he became fascinated by the place itself, the quiet hallways, the frail patients, and the constant presence of death seemed to pull him in. Hospital staff noticed him and offered him a job as an orderly. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary opportunity. In reality, it placed Harvey exactly where he wanted to be. Surrounded by the elderly, the sick, and the helpless, he discovered something that would consume him for the rest of his life. Power. The patients depended on him. Their medications, their care, and sometimes even their survival rested in his hands. That realization awakened something dark. Only weeks after starting the job, Harvey committed his first murder, smothering a vulnerable patient with a pillow. The death raised no alarms. The victim was already ill, and hospitals were busy places where death was expected. That silence became his greatest weapon. One murder became several, then several became dozens. Patients died from suffocation, poisoned food, tampered oxygen supplies, and other horrifying methods. Many never knew they were being targeted. Families mourned loved ones they believed had died naturally. Doctors signed paperwork. Funeral homes collected bodies. Meanwhile, a killer walked the halls unnoticed. As the years passed, Harvey's methods became even more disturbing. Cyanide, arsenic, rat poison, and other toxic substances became tools of murder. He slipped them into meals, drinks, and desserts, turning ordinary food into death sentences. Hospitals, places meant to heal, became hunting grounds. Outside of work, his life spiraled into chaos. Depression, suicide attempts, failed relationships, and an obsession with the occult pushed him further into darkness. His paranoia grew so severe that he began poisoning people in his personal life as well. Friends, neighbors, former lovers, and even family members became victims. Some were killed outright. Others were deliberately kept sick and weak so they could not leave him. For nearly 2 decades, Harvey moved through hospitals in Kentucky and Ohio like a ghost. Death followed wherever he worked, but suspicion never seemed to catch up to him. Then in 1987, the nightmare finally cracked open. After a motorcycle accident victim died unexpectedly in a hospital bed, an autopsy revealed traces of cyanide. What first appeared to be a tragic death suddenly became evidence of murder. Investigators quickly focused on Harvey, the nurse's aide assigned to the patient. When questioned, he confessed, but the confession uncovered something far worse than anyone imagined. Investigators linked him to dozens of suspicious deaths spanning years. The body count kept climbing as more evidence emerged. Harvey was eventually convicted of 37 murders, though he personally claimed the real number was closer to 70. Some estimates placed it even higher. His excuses ranged from mercy killings to claims that he was easing suffering. Yet those explanations collapsed under the weight of his own admissions. The murders gave him satisfaction. They gave him control. In court, he even laughed while the names of his victims were displayed before the jury. That reaction revealed the true horror behind the case. This was never about mercy. It was about domination over life and death. The man the media called the Angel of Death spent the rest of his life behind bars, buried beneath multiple life sentences. But even his ending carried a grim sense of irony. In 2017, after decades in prison, Harvey was beaten to death by fellow inmates inside his cell. Michael Joseph Swango. Michael Joseph Swango entered the world in 1954, born in Tacoma, Washington, before growing up in the quiet Midwestern town of Quincy, Illinois. On the surface, his childhood seemed ordinary enough, but beneath it sat a darker influence. His father, a troubled Vietnam veteran battling alcoholism and depression, often filled the house with stories of violence and death from his time in the military. While most children might have recoiled from such stories, they appeared to leave a lasting mark on young Michael. As he grew older, he seemed destined for success. He excelled academically, graduated as valedictorian of his high school class, served in the Marine Corps, and later graduated with honors from college. To everyone around him, he looked like the picture of discipline and achievement, but hidden beneath that polished exterior was something far more unsettling. The first warning signs emerged when Swango entered medical school. Classmates noticed his strange fascination with death almost immediately. While other students focused on healing patients, Swango seemed drawn towards suffering. He frequently questioned dying patients about their pain and displayed an unusual curiosity about their final moments. Then came the whispers. Patients appeared to die with alarming frequency when Swango was involved in their care. It happened often enough that fellow students began giving him a chilling nickname. Still, nobody seriously believed a future doctor could be deliberately harming people. The strange incidents were dismissed as coincidence, bad luck, or rumors. Even when Swango was caught falsifying a medical report, he escaped with little more than a warning. Despite concerns about both his competence and behavior, he graduated in 1983 and secured a prestigious residency position at Ohio State University. That was when the unease began turning into something far darker. At the hospital, patients who'd been stable suddenly deteriorated after encounters with Swango. One woman claimed he injected something into her IV moments before she suffered a seizure. Her warning went nowhere. Another patient died shortly after treatment, and disturbing evidence later surfaced, suggesting foul play. Yet somehow, Swango remained in place. As time passed, it became clear that patients were not his only targets. One day, he brought food for his fellow doctors. Soon afterwards, several became violently ill with symptoms consistent with poisoning. Nurses grew suspicious. Staff members raised concerns, but administrators hesitated to act, dismissing many of the warnings as paranoia and gossip. Eventually, the hospital chose not to keep him on staff. Yet astonishingly, he still received recommendation letters that helped him move on to new opportunities elsewhere. The danger wasn't ending. It was spreading. Back in Illinois, Swango found work as an EMT. Almost immediately, co-workers noticed his disturbing obsession with death and catastrophe. He spoke casually about horrific disasters and mass casualties, as if they fascinated him. Then the illnesses started. Co-workers who ate food or drank beverages he provided became violently sick. Suspicion grew stronger with each incident. Finally, investigators searched his home and uncovered a nightmare. Inside was a collection of poisons, toxic chemicals, and handwritten instructions describing how to manufacture some of the deadliest substances known to man. It looked less like the home of a medical professional and more like the laboratory of someone obsessed with killing. Swango was convicted and sent to prison. For most people, that would have been the end. For Michael Swango, it was only an intermission. After his release, he reinvented himself, lied about his past, and quietly worked his way back into medicine. Wherever he went, a familiar pattern followed. Colleagues became mysteriously ill. Patients died unexpectedly. Questions surfaced, but never quickly enough. In Virginia, co-workers fell sick. In South Dakota, his hidden past was finally discovered, leading to his dismissal. But even then, he slipped through the cracks, once more securing a psychiatry residency in New York. There, at a Veterans Affairs hospital filled with men who'd already sacrificed so much, investigators later concluded that Swango murdered multiple patients through poisoning. By the early 1990s, his career in America finally collapsed. He was exposed, blacklisted, and driven out of the medical profession. But the deaths did not stop. Swango fled overseas, finding work in Zimbabwe. Before long, patients there also began dying under suspicious circumstances. Authorities would later suspect him in multiple poisonings, several of them fatal. Even then, he was preparing for yet another medical position, this time in Saudi Arabia. Fate finally intervened in 1997. When Swango returned to the United States to handle visa paperwork, federal agents arrested him at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Initially, the charges involved fraud and deception, but investigators were only beginning to uncover the full scope of what they were dealing with. As authorities reopened old cases, they exhumed bodies and conducted new forensic examinations. Toxicology tests revealed what many had feared for years: poison. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Swango eventually pleaded guilty to multiple murders. He later admitted to another killing as well. Today, he remains imprisoned inside one of America's most secure federal prisons, serving multiple life sentences. Yet even now, many investigators believe the convictions barely scratched the surface. The most terrifying question surrounding Michael Swango has never been whether he killed. It is how many times. Authorities suspect the true number of victims could reach as high as 60. If that estimate is even close to accurate, then for years, a man sworn to save lives may have moved from hospital to hospital, country to country, leaving a trail of death hidden beneath a doctor's white coat. And that is what makes his story so disturbing. Monsters are often expected to look frightening. Michael Swango looked like a physician, and for decades, that disguise allowed horror to walk through hospital corridors unnoticed. Harold Shipman. Long before Harold Shipman became known as one of the most prolific killers in modern history, there was a moment in his youth that seemed to cast a dark shadow over everything that followed. At 17, he watched his mother slowly die from terminal lung cancer. Day after day, he sat beside her bed as doctors eased her suffering with powerful injections of morphine. While most sons would remember the heartbreak of losing a parent, something about those final months appeared to leave a far deeper mark on Shipman. Death, medicine, and control became intertwined in his mind. Not long after her death, he entered medical school, married, started a family, and built the image of a respectable young doctor. To the outside world, his future looked bright. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, something far darker may already have been taking shape. One of the earliest shadows appeared in 1972. A young girl suffering from severe disabilities was under his care in a hospital. Shipman encouraged her mother to briefly leave the room for a cup of tea. just minutes later, the child was dead. At the time, nobody suspected foul play. Decades later, investigators would revisit the case and wonder if that death had truly been natural. The unease only deepened. A few years later, Shipman was caught stealing large quantities of painkillers and injecting himself with staggering amounts of pethidine. His addiction nearly destroyed him. Yet despite convictions for fraud and forgery, he was allowed to keep practicing medicine. That decision would prove catastrophic. In the small town of Hyde, Shipman reinvented himself. Patients loved him. Elderly residents trusted him completely. He seemed devoted, compassionate, and unusually willing to make house calls. Families viewed him as the kind of doctor every community wished it had. What they could not see was the nightmare unfolding behind closed doors. For years, elderly patients began dying shortly after visits from Shipman. The pattern was subtle at first. A grandmother passed away unexpectedly, then another. Most were older women whose deaths seemed easy to explain. No alarms sounded. No investigations followed. Meanwhile, Shipman refined his methods. He would often wait until relatives stepped out of the room before injecting victims with lethal doses of diamorphine. Sometimes the amount was so enormous that it could have killed hundreds of people. Then, standing beside the body he had just created, he would calmly sign the death certificate himself and reassure grieving families that no further examination was necessary. The horror grew year after year. By the late 1990s, he was killing at an astonishing pace. Entire families unknowingly welcomed a predator into their homes. The very person trusted to preserve life had transformed into a silent executioner. Every knock at the door, every house call, every reassuring smile concealed something monstrous. His downfall finally arrived in 1998 when he targeted 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, a respected and active member of the community. After her sudden death, Shipman made a reckless mistake. He forged a will, leaving her entire estate to himself. Unlike many others, Grundy's daughter refused to accept the explanation she was given. Her persistence led investigators to exhume the body, where lethal levels of morphine were discovered. Once police began digging deeper, the scale of the horror became impossible to ignore. The trusted doctor was exposed as a serial killer. Investigators eventually linked him to at least 15 murders at trial, though later inquiries concluded the true number exceeded 200 victims. Many believe the real total may never be known. The most chilling part was not how he killed, it was how completely he hid in plain sight. For decades, he exploited trust, targeting elderly women whose deaths attracted little scrutiny. To the world, they were statistics. To their families, they were beloved mothers, grandmothers, and friends. In 2000, Shipman was sentenced to life in prison. 3 years later, just before his birthday, he took his own life inside his cell. Christopher Daniel Dunst. Christopher Daniel Dunst seemed destined for greatness. Born in 1971 and raised in a comfortable Memphis suburb, he came from a respected family. His father worked as a missionary and physical therapist, while his mother was a school teacher. Nothing about his early life suggested the nightmare that would eventually unfold. In fact, everything pointed in the opposite direction. He was intelligent, ambitious, and exceptionally successful. After earning degrees from the University of Memphis and the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, he built a reputation as a rising star in medicine. He earned both a medical degree and a PhD, excelled in research, secured millions in grant funding, and gained admission into one of medicine's most prestigious honor societies. To colleagues and mentors, he looked like the future of neurosurgery. But beneath that impressive resume, cracks were already beginning to form. During the mid-2000s, troubling stories started circulating among people who knew him personally. Former acquaintances described nights filled with heavy drug use, including cocaine, LSD, and prescription painkillers. There were allegations that he showed up to work after marathon drug-fueled binges. Questions emerged about his fitness to practice medicine, yet somehow he continued moving forward. Warnings appeared, then disappeared. Doors that should have closed remained wide open. By 2011, Dunst arrived in Dallas with enormous confidence and an even bigger reputation. He secured surgical privileges at major hospitals and quickly began attracting patients. To them, he appeared exactly as a talented surgeon should. He was charismatic, self-assured, and convincing. He spoke as if he possessed skills that set him apart from everyone else in his field. Many trusted him with their lives. Some would never get those lives back. At first, the problems seemed like isolated mistakes. Complications happen in surgery. Even excellent surgeons occasionally face poor outcomes. But as case after case piled up, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. Patients who entered the operating room expecting relief instead left with catastrophic injuries. Healthy tissue was damaged, nerves were severed, critical structures were destroyed. People who walked into surgery under their own power woke up unable to move. Others never woke up at all. The operating room, a place designed for healing, seemed to transform into something far more sinister whenever Dunch stood over the table. One of the most heartbreaking cases involved Jerry Summers, a close friend who trusted him completely. Summers underwent what should have been a routine spinal procedure. There was no reason to expect disaster, but when the surgery ended, his life had been shattered. He emerged as a quadriplegic. He could still feel pain. He could still understand everything happening around him, but his body no longer obeyed him. A man who had walked into the hospital was now trapped inside himself. Even after such a devastating outcome, Dunch continued operating. The injuries continued. Then came Kelly Martin. She sought treatment for chronic back pain after a simple fall. Like countless patients before her, she placed her faith in a surgeon she believed would help her. Instead, she died. She bled to death following surgery, becoming one of the first fatalities directly connected to his growing trail of destruction. By then, concern inside the medical community was turning into alarm. Yet somehow, the nightmare continued. After leaving one hospital, Dunch simply moved to another. There, the horror escalated. One patient, Floella Brown, suffered a catastrophic stroke after Dunch accidentally cut a major artery during surgery. While she was fighting for her life, he proceeded to perform another operation the very same day. The next patient was Mary Efford. What doctors discovered afterward was almost unbelievable. A nerve root had been completely severed. Surgical screws were drilled into incorrect locations. Hardware had been placed where it never should have been. The damage was so extensive that other surgeons struggled to understand how so many mistakes could occur during a single procedure. Mary survived, but her life was permanently altered. By now, whispers had become warnings. Warnings became panic. Experienced surgeons began reviewing his cases and finding devastation wherever they looked. The numbers were staggering. Out of just 38 patients operated on over a 2-year period, 31 suffered severe injuries or permanent disabilities. 2 died from complications. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Hospital after hospital had witnessed the destruction. Yet through administrative failures, poor oversight, and bureaucratic delays, he continued finding opportunities to operate. For patients, there was no way to know that walking into surgery could become the worst decision of their lives. Finally, in 2013, fellow physicians took action and alerted regulators. His surgical privileges were revoked, bringing an end to the damage he could inflict inside an operating room. But for many victims, the intervention came too late. Years later, prosecutors built a criminal case. Unlike almost any ever brought against a physician, this was not a story of simple malpractice or negligence. Investigators argued that Dunch's actions went far beyond incompetence. In 2017, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Today, Christopher Dunch remains behind bars. The operating rooms are silent now. No new patients will climb onto his surgical tables. Yet his story continues to haunt the medical world because of one terrifying reality. People enter surgery at their most vulnerable. They surrender consciousness, place absolute trust in a stranger, and hope to wake up healed. For dozens of Christopher Dunch's patients, that trust became a nightmare. What began as the story of a brilliant surgeon slowly transformed into something far darker, a tale of shattered bodies, ruined lives, and a trail of devastation hidden behind a white coat and a confident smile. John Bodkin Adams. John Bodkin Adams arrived in the world in 1899, born into a strict religious family in Northern Ireland. His childhood was marked by loss. First, his father died from a stroke. Then his younger brother was taken by the influenza pandemic. Surrounded by grief from an early age, Adams grew into a quiet, solitary young man who rarely connected with others. He studied medicine and eventually settled in the seaside town of Eastbourne in the 1920s. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary doctor building a respectable life. But beneath that image, something unsettling was beginning to emerge. Over the years, Adams developed an unusual habit of attaching himself to wealthy patients. He inserted himself into their lives, their homes, and often their finances. One elderly patient loaned him a large sum of money that allowed him to buy a prestigious house. Others found him lingering around their homes at mealtimes or helping himself to things that did not belong to him. Then the inheritances started appearing. One patient left him a substantial fortune, then another and another. Soon, whispers began spreading through Eastbourne. People noticed that Adams seemed to appear in an extraordinary number of wills. Rumors followed him through the decades like a shadow, yet nothing could be proven, and the respected doctor continued practicing medicine. By the 1950s, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. Patients under Adams's care often seemed to leave him valuable gifts shortly before their deaths. Wealthy widows, elderly patients, and vulnerable individuals repeatedly named him as a beneficiary. Some locals began to wonder whether these deaths were simply coincidences or something much darker. The suspicion reached a terrifying new level in 1956 with the death of a wealthy woman named Gertrude Hullett. Hullett had been struggling emotionally after the loss of her husband. Adams prescribed her powerful sedatives and closely supervised her treatment. When she fell into a deep coma after an apparent overdose, warning signs were everywhere. Her symptoms pointed toward poisoning. Medical tests eventually revealed massive amounts of barbiturates in her body, far beyond a fatal dose. Yet crucial treatment was delayed. Questions piled up. Why had Adams failed to recognize the overdose? Why had he dismissed obvious signs? Why did he provide only a fraction of the recommended antidote? Why was he arranging discussions about an autopsy before the woman had even died? Then investigators discovered something even more disturbing. Just days before her death, Hullett had given Adams a large check. She had also left him an expensive Rolls-Royce in her will. Almost immediately after her death, Adams moved to claim both. To many observers, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. As police dug deeper, they uncovered an astonishing fact. Adams had appeared in the wills of more than 130 patients. The image that emerged was deeply unsettling. According to town gossip, wealthy patients would rewrite their wills in his favor, and shortly afterward they would die. The allegations exploded into a national sensation. Newspapers painted Adams as a doctor who preyed upon the vulnerable. Police began examining countless deaths connected to his practice. Some believed they were looking at a serial killer hiding behind a medical license. In 1957, Adams stood trial for murder. The courtroom became a battlefield of conflicting testimony, missing evidence, and damaged witness accounts. Critical records undermined parts of the prosecution's case, while other evidence never reached the jury. After a short deliberation, Adams was found not guilty, but the verdict did not erase the fear. Many investigators remained convinced that he had escaped justice, even after being later convicted of prescription fraud and removed from the medical register. Suspicion never left him. Though he eventually returned to practicing medicine, a dark cloud followed him for the rest of his life. When Adams died in 1983, he left behind a substantial fortune, much of it acquired through the wills of former patients. And with his death came no clear answers, only an enduring mystery. Whether he was a calculating predator who quietly profited from death or a doctor forever trapped beneath suspicion, one fact remained unchanged. For decades, countless people looked at the graves scattered around Eastbourne and wondered how many secrets had been buried with them.